Welcome, fellow plebs. My name is Sean, and this is
Tribunus Plebis.
Take it or leave it. Medicine or rent. They're stealing your jobs. This is all you're worth. We will leave you. You don't understand. Monsters lie beyond the walls. These are the things they tell us. These are the things they beat into our heads as simple, plain realities. That we are lucky to exist, that we are lucky to make a minimum wage, that we are lucky our jobs have not been sent to some decrepit foreign country. We are all lucky that some disreputable and shifty foreigner has not taken our job here at home, and if you don't like it, go live in the street. $5 per hour is all you're worth, and you're lucky we do that. We could pay you less here, and you could beg for less elsewhere. We will leave your town or just close our business if we can't pay you less than that. You just don't understand. They tell us that they have no money to help some poor people in Chicago or Fort Worth. That money is needed because monsters lie beyond those walls. Perpetual war can be funded, but no money can be spared to help the citizenry. Don't you get it? These are exertions of power, plain and simple. They are levers used by the powerful to remain powerful by instilling fear and uncertainty into our hearts and minds. When they say winning hearts and minds, what they are actually saying is sowing fear, discontent, and uncertainty. This is the boot upon our chests. Our workplaces are overcome with fear, uncertainty, and discontent. You want to raise the minimum wage? Well, we will move to Mexico, swear to God. Then where will you be? If the production of the worker has increased by 300% and profits are up, why aren't wages improving? This is what every textbook tells us should be happening, yet in the real world, it doesn't work. From a systemic perspective, those who hold the power are loath to relinquish it. As we look at the world through a lens which shows that the actions and reactions of the powerful for what they are, exertions to claim and retain power, this becomes ever clearer. There is an economic and political reason for low wages in general, and the past 50 years of nearly flat real wages. There is also an aspect that is inescapably congruous with growing wealth inequality. When it comes to wages, that is pay for work, we have an immense inequality of power between ownership and labor. It is ridiculous for the vast immensity of workers to enter into a quote-unquote fair negotiation of wages with any sort of small to large business. It certainly can happen. Some people do have a certain amount of leverage due to, super specialization or lack of other candidates, but these are relatively rare across the spectrum, so I mention it only to piss on it. It is not a real argument. Don't let them bamboozle you. This power dichotomy is not a mistake, and it is not a symptom of some other issue. The power imbalance is purposefully baked into a system which presupposes scarcity and demands constant profit growth and mass distribution of wealth to the investor class at the expense of all else. For the past 40 years, real wages adjusted for inflation, have remained almost completely flat. Low employment before COVID and a current surge, not really past COVID, but, coming to the end of hopefully the worst of it, they haven't done much to change any of this, which is one reason why we are experiencing a recent surge of union strikes and general labor unrest. Put simply and clearly, the working class has not gotten a real wage in a long time, and it's starting to get pissed. So, while there are a lot of reasons for the flatness of wages, we are going to focus on one in particular here, monopsony. Now, for anyone who is unfamiliar with this term, monopsony is the lesser known, less understood bastard cousin of the more commonly encountered term monopoly. A monopoly is a situation where a firm or person is the sole supplier of a good or service. A monopsony is a little different. It is when a certain firm or person is the sole buyer of a good or service. And I just want to linger on that definition for a second here. Monopsony is the sole buyer, or purchaser of a good or service. Let's take a very quick look at one of our favorite subjects that we recently covered here at Tribunus Plebes, coal towns and company towns. In a coal town, the coal company has a monopsony on labor. They are the only buyer of labor in the area. You literally can't work in town unless you work for the coal company. Because of this, wages can be kept extremely depressed. Now, I only linger here a little bit because I want everyone to understand that labor is something that we sell, and that our labor is something that companies are purchasing. Plus, for this episode, we will be primarily concerned with monopsony power in the labor market. A labor monopsony harms workers because by flexing their power over the available workforce, firms are able to pay wages far below the level that would occur in a more competitive economy. Empirically, it appears that the labor market is strengthening. So where are the wage hikes one would expect? Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell called the situation a bit of a puzzle in June of 2018 and alluded to that remark again in comments in 2021. This sort of impotent head-scratching from the supposed elites in leadership continues even into 2022. But it's really not confusing enough to refer to it as a puzzle, even despite some very small and sector-dependent wage raises that have popped up as we come out of the lockdowns and COVID years. But even then, wages are still lagging and remaining far too flat year over year. And let's use a favorite example here and talk about a rural hospital. In this case, a hospital has both monopoly and monopsony power. If the next nearest hospital is a 90-minute drive away, the rural hospital is more or less free to charge whatever it wants, particularly for emergency services. Patients, aka the customers, have no place else to go if they need urgent care and are forced to pay whatever the hospital asks. The hospital also benefits from monopsonistic power as well. If you're a doctor, nurse, or administrator, or even an EMT or janitor in the region, there is no other firm to purchase your labor. Invariably, these doctors, nurses, and lower-level staff and administrators will make less money per year than those who live close to multiple hospitals. Now think about Amazon, the 800-pound gorilla of the labor world. When Amazon moves a warehouse into an area, wages for warehouse workers in that same area who do not work for Amazon are almost immediately depressed as Amazon, usually, becomes the single largest employer in that area. Quote, "In the years since Amazon opened its stores in Lexington County, annual earnings for warehouse workers in the area have fallen from $47,000 to $32,000, a decline of over 30%. Lexington County is not alone. Since Amazon opened a warehouse in Chesterfield, Virginia, warehouse wages in the region have fallen by 17%. In Tracy, California, they have dropped by 16%. End quote. And here's another one. Quote, "After Amazon opened a storage depot, local wages for warehouse workers fell by an average of 3%. In places where Amazon operates, such workers earn about 10% less than similar workers employed elsewhere in that region." End quote. And you might think something like, but Amazon doesn't have that many warehouses, and not many other companies are as big or powerful as Amazon. How could this situation be? How pervasive is it? And the answer is, it's very pervasive. As companies consolidate via mergers and acquisitions, their monopsony powers only grow. Quote, "In real terms, the average publicly traded firm is 3 times larger today than it was 20 years ago. Lax enforcement of antitrust regulations and increasing technological barriers to entry appear to be important factors behind this trend. Overall, our findings suggest that the nature of U.S. product markets has undergone a structural shift that has weakened competition." End quote. When it comes to wages, pay for work, we have always had an immense inequality of power between ownership and labor when labor is not organized. As companies continue to merge and union power is destroyed through legislation, the power differential is continually growing. This is further exacerbated as these large companies use their ever-expanding political power to destroy unions and leave individual laborers to defend for themselves in a pond that the company all but owns and stocks with Piranha. We can even track this down with the Supreme Court decision in the Janus versus Municipal Employees decision in 2017, when the court said that public workers did not have to pay union dues or join the union to receive the benefits of the union. This decision by these black-clad judicial ghouls has not just harmed unions now, but will continue to cause downstream monopsonistic effects by lowering wages and allowing workplaces to further leverage their power over even unionized sectors. What we must fully understand here is that labor markets are not truly competitive, or at least not nearly as competitive as many economists have assumed. Or, I guess to be more clear here, not as competitive as the talking head economists we see in here on TV, radio, and dork-controlled podcasts lie to us about because they are paid to peddle this nonsense to us. Economists, like actual economists who care, they know better than this. If a labor market were to be truly competitive, firms would be raising wages right now all across the board and trying to draw workers from other firms. But any wage increases we see are too low, too sequestered, or too sporadic. After all, they keep telling us that there is a labor shortage, right? If they were actually competitive, then wages would shadow productivity growth, right? As this back and forth bidding escalates to attract workers, wages and overall compensation should rise, right? I mean, that's how it's supposed to work, right? Well, it doesn't, and they don't. Monopsony kills the supposed competition. Monopsony is particularly destructive in rural areas where a single employer, or a small number of them, completely and utterly dominate the local labor market. The leverage these companies have is enormous, and they wield it with utter ruthlessness. The workers' proposition is to accept a low wage and eat meagerly, or to starve. Or, if we are really being terrible people, it's to move and to uproot their families and go into debt in the process because moving is super expensive. Moving is, in fact, beyond these people's means, even if they felt it was the best choice. So most people stay and work for these depressed wages, or they simply opt out of the workforce after deciding that the effort simply just is not worth it. And importantly, companies like Amazon, rural jails, and rural hospitals know, understand, and rely on these forces to guarantee themselves cheap labor. Monopsonistic practices by corporations are simply an exertion of power over the labor force. One way that we can think about this in a power context is by considering the firm and the employee's opportunity costs when it comes to, taking new jobs. And what I mean by that is what each will gain and lose if an employee leaves. For the firm, the cost might be the experience of the worker and how this impacts their ability to do their job. The gain might be paying a new employee less to do the old employee's job. For a worker, the cost might be some loss of benefits or seniority, or even a reputation cost, as a lot of employers balk at hiring people who change jobs frequently. But the gain on the employee side might be a higher salary, less commute, and more prestige. And there is literally a mathematical formula that has been used to capture this for studies, which I'll put on the YouTube link when this is up. But basically, what all this means is that if the opportunity cost for the workers is higher than the employer's opportunity cost, then the employer can steal more surplus value from the worker, and if the worker's cost is lower than the employer's, then the worker then has more power. Because of this fairly straightforward truth, firms are heavily incentivized to maintain their power at all costs. This power dichotomy is not a mistake, and it is not a symptom of some other issue. The power imbalance is purposefully baked into a system which presupposes scarcity and demands constant profit growth and mass distribution of wealth to the investor class at the expense of all else. And moving beyond plainly geographic monopsonies, such as, the rural hospital or an isolated sawmill, there exist other methods for creating and enforcing monopsony. Market concentration, where there are one or a very limited number of firms buying the same form of labor, is one example. As mergers and acquisition continue, and small business growth continues to shrink, we would expect even more concentration of labor buying power to manifest. Collusion amongst firms is another one. Collusion is illegal. It is plainly against the law to fix wages and/or benefits or to limit the free movement of labor in any labor market. It is time to acknowledge we have a problem here and fight back. If the populace refuses to unionize, then legal recourse is a must. Both explicit and implicit collusion amongst firms to manipulate wage costs is technically illegal, but nobody does anything about it. This collusion does not have to be explicitly agreed to. A simple wink and nod agreement to not raise wages or to not poach each other's workers is just as illegal, at least technically, as an organized written contract that spells out the same. Often, companies will time raises, attempt to match benefits, and include in their benefit packages poison pills that make it difficult for an employee to switch companies. Poison pills can include things as simple as waiting periods for health insurance, which can complicate workers' lives and prevent them from changing jobs, especially if they have pre-existing conditions or a sick partner or child. And while collusion is, as I said, illegal between competing firms, there is a weird gray area that exists within firms. To explore this, let's talk about fast food franchises. Quite often, a franchisee of a fast food restaurant will own multiple locations. In fact, they usually are buying a franchise region, not just one location. And within that region, they can build multiple stores. Collusion is not illegal, or at least hasn't been judged illegal yet, in this situation. So the different locations across a city or region of a McDonald's, let's say, can collude to not hire from other restaurants owned by the same franchisee. In fact, a study by Kruger and Ashenfelter titled Theory and Evidence on Employer Collusion in the Franchise Sector for Princeton University Industrial Relations showed that due to collusion, fast food jobs, which look like 162 individual locations throughout Rhode Island competing for workers, was, in fact, only 6 employers when collusion is taken into account. This is preposterous. Even more, regarding collusion, there was a lawsuit filed by the Justice Department against Silicon Valley tech firms after it was discovered and proven that they had agreed, literally in writing, to not hire each other's engineers. This stuff has happened, is happening, and will continue to happen if we don't stop it. And to go along with collusion, let's talk about non-compete clauses. They are perhaps the most direct and obvious attempt to create monopsony power that isn't hidden at all. It's just all right out in the open in employment contracts. Non-compete clauses are legal in the United States and are sometimes even justifiable if we listen to the companies. They tell us they have legitimate concerns about some employees taking secrets to competitors. However, even amongst those few firms that may be able to justify a non-compete, they all have alternate means to protect their interests. How far non-compete clauses have crept into the workforce cannot be understated, and we shouldn't allow them to continue to hinder our ability to change jobs. Famously, the sandwich chain Jimmy John's included a non-compete clause in all of their employment contracts. They want to prevent workers from leaving and going to other sandwich shops like Subway or Blimpies, which is so absurd that it defies reality, yet there it was. There is no viable justification for this sort of restriction, which is why the chain was forced to drop the clause for all of its employees when it was legally challenged. And even where maybe a non-compete could be justified, and maybe I could talk myself into it in special circumstances, they should be incredibly difficult to defend, and the firm which wants to use them should be forced to make a valid, irrefutable claim that it is necessary before it is allowed to be put in place. And this argument should be made before it is included in a contract, and it shouldn't be a burden on the worker to prove it when they try to change jobs. However, all of that just goes to show how far firms will go to directly influence the labor market in which they supposedly compete. And there is absolutely no justification ever, not ever, for any low-wage worker to sign a non-compete, period. Janitors, sandwich makers, data entry, and burger flippers need to be able to move from job to job unbound. Now, pay scales and seniority can also be effective poison pills. I see this all the time in my industry, where basically any company worth working for has some sort of pay scale and honors seniority. Even if one firm pays a little bit more than the next, workers will tend to not make the change if they have to start at the bottom of the pay scale and the bottom of the seniority list. If a worker has to change jobs, they would make much less money, usually for 4 years or more, before the higher wage even kicks in, and they will be last in seniority to start, and they will likely linger in a role too junior to get what they want for decades sometimes, which means that they will be forced to do the least pleasant jobs at that new firm. And because of this, people in my industry almost never switch between firms. They almost always stay at the first company that they get real seniority at. Now, pay scale does actually have some benefits, and so does seniority being honored. But it certainly also complicates changing jobs, especially once you've been established somewhere. Another thing that contributes to monopsony is a category called job lock. Now, job lock technically kind of covers most or all of the things I'm listing here. But usually when people talk about job lock, they are primarily focusing on health insurance and the various issues that arise when we attempt to change workplaces. Pre-existing conditions, as an example, are a huge concern. Attempting to figure out if the insurance at a potential new employer covers a needed medication or needed procedure, because not all insurance does, is both stressful and difficult. And being unable to move for a better wage if the new firm's insurance does not cover those things is absolutely disgusting. The Affordable Care Act / Obamacare actually did help break down this barrier slightly, but the act itself, for the small good it did in some cases, is slowly being torn down by political opponents, and the roadblocks are being erected once again, which is just one other reason why we need Medicare for all in this stupid-ass country. Please, God, get something right. So another way that monopsony is cemented is through geography and mobility of labor. Fewer offers come from ever fewer firms. Lower physical mobility, especially as wages remain flat or depressed, affects workers' ability to switch jobs. Lack of public transport, lack of ability to move to where the work is, especially for families, all of these issues and more go into this area. As fewer firms compete, there are fewer paths to wage increases by switching jobs, which has long been the primary method of ladder climbing in the United States. Lastly, we have temp work, outsourcing, and employment agencies, which is what we covered in our last episode about the fissuring workplace. But as a reminder, when the outsourced, gig, contract, or temp agency employed data entry clerk taps away at his or her keyboard, they are completely and utterly shut out of the most basic method of improving one's wages: actually being an employee of the company which they are working for. So what can be done? Well, I keep finding it funny when I hit the end of these episodes and ask the rhetorical question, what can be done here? Because the answers are like 80% always the same. And there are indeed weapons to be wielded against this oppressive force. Unions are one. Organized labor can exert its own pressure on those who employ it, even in situations where the employer may otherwise possess monopsonistic leverage. The other major weapon here are the antitrust laws of the United States. Long dormant, these laws can be used to break and halt monopsonistic practices. The Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission are responsible for enforcing antitrust laws, but have sadly failed labor at every turn lately. Almost all antitrust legislation and popular concern is focused on the monopoly side of things in regards to mergers and the production of goods and services. While the DOJ and FTC have failed labor there, it has barely even acknowledged the other side of the same coin, monopsony. Even Senator John Sherman, The dude who the Sherman Antitrust Act was named after saw this. One of the reasons he gave was this, quote, "It commands the price of labor without fear of strikes, for in its field it allows no competitors," end quote. And Sherman said that in 1890. People had this figured out in 1890, guys. Even more sad, and really, I guess, an explanation for the previously mentioned failure of the antitrust enforcement, is that the enforcers of antitrust laws, the police, if you will, have tended to historically view the labor market as naturally competitive and have focused much of their wrath on trying to halt unions from organizing and collectively bargaining, calling them rent seekers. You see, if you view the labor market as naturally competitive and always achieving equilibrium, and I just want to say here, by the way, as I'm going on, anytime you hear people talking about the economy and they say competitive or they say equilibrium, throw them out of your house. They are about to lie to you. When these people view the labor market as competitive and achieving equilibrium because they remember supply and demand graphs from their Econ 101 class, then they actually believe that collective bargaining is an existential threat and mere rent seeking. Additionally, antitrust cops, like all cops, have historically sought to protect the capital owners rather than the oppressed working class. This has to change. And further considering antitrust, we need to look at Robert Bork, former justice on the U.S. Court of Appeals, made most famous for his rejected candidacy to the United States Supreme Court by Ronald Reagan in 1987. But Bork had, in his career, an outsized influence on many things, and yeah, he was an unrepentant black-clad ghoul until his death. And one of the things he influenced for the worst was antitrust enforcement. Bork argued, and has since been cited by every right-wing justice and many centrists as well. His argument was that when considering antitrust measures, one had to look at only one thing. Would customers benefit? Would prices be lower, essentially? Basically, this Borkian view is suggesting that even when there are pretty obvious detriments to the labor force in any particular merger, anyone assessing this merger must conclude that any of these losses will benefit the now merged company and therefore reduce costs, and therefore these savings will be passed down to the customers, and therefore the merger is good even though it harms so many. This false belief is centered on an absolutely moronic interpretation that we live in a perfect world where things happen just as Econ 101, and again, Econ 101 is just an extremely simplified version of, economic thought. It's not actually a guide, but they think that this happens just as Econ 101 says they should. But we don't live in that world. Econ 101 is not what we should base policy on, and we need to rethink all of antitrust because of that. This idiotic standard means nothing, but it allows the mega mergers we see today. It allows 5 companies to own most of the food you eat. It allows 3 companies to own all of the media you consume. It allows 2 companies to own all of your bathing products. Now, before I sign off, I want to recommend to anyone who hasn't yet listened to the previous episode about fissuring of labor to go do that now. Fissuring is just another method of establishing and flexing monopsonistic power and purposefully depressing wages and oppressing the working class. It is just disgusting what these people are doing to us. And that, my friends, is the end of the episode. And I thank you all for listening. And we do have one new thing that's going on over here at Tribunus Plebis. We have opened a Buy Me a Coffee page, which is, sort of a Patreon type of website, except it allows one-time donations as well. So if anybody feels generous, if you like what we're doing here at this project, then please, follow the link in the description below here. And you can sign up for a recurring monthly charge, or you can just hit us with a one-time tip if you want. Any help would be appreciated. We love doing this, but it does honestly take a lot of work to put these episodes together and a lot of time. That's it. And listen, if you have no money or you don't want to contribute, that's fine too. We're cool. We're still going to put everything out for free. Other than that, you can review on Apple Podcasts. The link's also below. And also, we have the YouTube channel, Tribunus Plebis Media. You can search that. Please follow and subscribe. And share anything that you like on social media or with your friends. And that's it. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Love you all. Take care.